Pack your things and get out. This house isn't yours anymore." Those were the exact words my husband said to me, standing in the living room I paid for. What he didn't know, what neither he nor that young woman beside him understood, was that I was the one who owned everything. Completely. Legally. Irrevocably. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 58 years old. And for most of my life, I was just a quiet wife, the kind who stayed in the background, supported her husband, and never asked for more than peace. If you're watching this, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single comment. Because people like them, they always assume you're weak, unaware that you're simply waiting, unaware that you already know how this ends. Now let me tell you how everything actually began. 32 years ago, my husband Daniel and I stood in front of a half-finished house on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by dust, exposed wood, and a future we both believed we were building together. At least, that was the story he liked to tell. In reality, it was never equal. Daniel had ambition. Yes, but ambition without structure collapses quickly. I was the one working 2 jobs, tracking every dollar, making decisions that turned uncertainty into stability. While he chased ideas that rarely lasted, I focused on things that did: investments, small properties, a company I quietly registered under my own name long before he ever thought to ask where the money was really coming from. He never questioned it, not because he trusted me completely, but because he never paid attention to the details that actually mattered. Ownership, contracts, signature. The invisible lines that decide who controls what when everything falls apart. Over time, that lack of attention became something else. Comfort. And comfort, when left unchecked, slowly turns into entitlement. To him, the house became ours, then his. The accounts we used became shared, then assumed. The life I built in silence became something he believed he deserved by default. And I let him believe it. Not because I was naive, but because at the time, I still believed in something simpler. I believed that loyalty meant permanence. That if you built something together, neither person would ever try to take it from the other. Looking back now, I understand how dangerous that belief was. Because while I was focused on protecting what we had built, Daniel was slowly becoming someone who no longer saw it as something we shared, but something he was entitled to claim. The shift did not happen overnight. It never does. If it had, I might have seen it sooner. Instead, it unfolded in small, almost forgettable moments. Subtle changes in tone, in language, in the way Daniel started to talk about things that used to belong to both of us. At first, it was harmless. He began using words like my investments when referring to properties I had purchased. He spoke about his house when talking to friends. Even though he had never once been involved in the legal side of owning it, I noticed, of course. But I chose silence. I told myself it was just ego, just harmless pride. Then the questions started. Not direct at first. Casual. Strategic. He would ask about how the accounts were structured, how taxes were being handled, whether it would be simpler if everything was consolidated under one name. His name. He framed it as efficiency, as convenience, as something that would benefit both of us. But there was something in the way he asked, too calculated, too rehearsed, that made me pause. Around that time, he began staying out later. Work. he said. Meetings. Opportunities. The kind of vague explanations that are just detailed enough to sound believable, but never specific enough to be verified. Conversations between us became shorter, more transactional. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing the routines we had built over decades. It was as if he had already begun stepping out of the life we shared, without telling me. And then came her. Vanessa, 30 years younger, sharp, observant, and far too aware of the environment she had stepped into. She did not pretend to like me. She did not need to. Everything about her presence felt intentional, the way she listened when Daniel talked about finances, the way she asked questions that seemed innocent but were anything but. She was not interested in our history. She was interested in what that history had built. At first, I told myself it would pass, that Daniel would come back to himself, to the life we had spent decades creating. But deep down, something else had already begun to form. A quiet realization I was not ready to fully accept yet, because the truth was, I was starting to see a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The night everything finally surfaced did not begin with an argument. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, no warning signs that anything was about to change. That was what made it so precise, so deliberate. Daniel had always avoided conflict when it did not serve him, and this time was no different. He waited until everything was already decided. He asked me to sit down in the living room. Vanessa was already there, standing slightly behind him, close enough to be involved, far enough to pretend she was not. That alone told me everything I needed to know. This was not a conversation. It was a presentation. Daniel spoke calmly, too calmly. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he had found clarity. Words that sounded rehearsed, polished, as if they had been practiced more than once before being delivered to me. Then he said he wanted a divorce. Not as a question, not as a discussion. As a conclusion, I listened without interrupting. Not because I was in shock, but because something inside me had already begun to settle into place. A kind of clarity that comes when everything you suspected quietly confirms itself all at once. Then came the part they thought I would not question. He placed a folder on the table in front of me. Inside were documents, property transfers, financial authorizations, legal adjustments that, if signed, would shift control of everything into his hands. He did not explain them in detail. He did not need to. Vanessa leaned forward slightly and said, "It just makes things simpler for everyone." Simpler. That word lingered longer than anything else. Because there was nothing simple about what they were asking. It was calculated, structured, planned well in advance. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. This was not just betrayal. It was strategy. But what they did not know, what they were completely unaware of, was that I had already seen enough to understand exactly what they were trying to do. So I did the one thing they were not prepared for. I did not react. After that night, I did exactly what they expected me to do. At least, that is what it looked like. I stayed quiet. I did not argue. I did not question the documents. I moved through the house the same way I always had, calm, controlled, almost distant. And that was exactly what gave me the advantage. Because the moment people believe they have already won, they stop paying attention. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. Not in panic, not in confusion, but with complete clarity. I brought every document I had access to, every record, every agreement Daniel had never taken the time to understand. And as we went through everything, piece by piece, one truth became undeniable. Daniel did not own anything. Not the house. Not the accounts. Not the businesses. Everything had been structured under my company for years, layered with legal protections Daniel had never once questioned. He had lived inside a system he benefited from, without ever realizing he had no control over it. And the documents he had placed in front of me? They were not routine. They were an attempt to override that structure. To transfer authority, he never had the right to claim lace. But that was not the only thing we uncovered. There were emails, messages, consultations with a legal advisor he had not mentioned, conversations outlining timelines, pressure points, even suggestions on how to present the documents in a way that would make them seem harmless. Vanessa's name appeared more than once. Not emotionally, strategically. That was the moment everything became clear. This was not a mistake. It was a plan. And suddenly, the situation shifted in a way they could not see yet. Because now, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was controlling what would happen next. So I made a decision. I would not confront them. Not yet. I would let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe, that I was overwhelmed, uncertain, and ready to give in. Because sometimes, the most powerful position you can be in is the one where your opponent thinks you do not understand the game at all. The final confrontation happened 2 weeks later, in that same living room where he told me to leave. Only this time, there were more people present, my lawyer, a legal representative, and documents that told a very different story. Daniel started confidently, explaining how things would proceed, until my lawyer interrupted him and placed the real ownership papers on the table. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized the truth. The house wasn't his. The accounts weren't his. Nothing was his. And then came the final blow, the evidence of coercion, enough to put him in serious legal trouble. Sophie didn't say a word. She just stood up and walked out. Daniel tried to argue, to justify, to shift blame, but it was too late. Within a month, he had lost everything. Not because I took it from him, but because it was never his to begin with. As for me, I stayed. Not out of attachment, but out of closure. Because sometimes, you don't walk away to prove strength. Sometimes, you stand your ground so others understand it. Money reveals who people really are. And truth always finds its way to the surface. I don't hate Daniel. I don't even regret what happened. Because in the end, he didn't lose me. I chose to let him go. If you were in my position, would you have done the same? If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, sometimes the strongest voice is the one that finally refuses to stay silent.